The year is 1936, less than 2 decades have passed since the end of the Great War. Yet the world does not feel at peace. The scars of that devastating war are still fresh. The world of 1936 was a world haunted by its recent past, especially in Europe. The Treaty of Versailles became a source of lasting bitterness, especially in Germany. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, was struggling to assert its authority. When faced with acts of aggression, the League proved powerless. In the post-war turmoil, a new and dangerous type of leader came to power. In Italy, Benito Mussolini seized control, crushing opposition and cultivating a cult of personality. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rose from the ashes, exploiting anger over the Treaty of Versailles. Meanwhile, the Empire of Japan grew increasingly militaristic, believing it was their destiny to dominate East Asia. These three powers shared a disdain for democracy and believed in their right to conquer. They aimed to overturn the world order established after World War I, creating a new and alarming dynamic in global politics. The political instability of the 1930s was fueled by the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash in 1929 sent shockwaves globally, plunging nations into crisis. International trade collapsed, and the intricate web of loans unraveled. This despair made people vulnerable to extremist movements. In Germany, it created conditions for the rise of the Nazi Party. In Japan, economic hardship strengthened the military, justifying expansion. Democracies focused inward, contributing to political weakness on the world stage. By 1936, the balance of power was beginning to crumble. The world was dividing. Germany, Italy, and Japan were dissatisfied with the existing world order. They were rapidly rearming and openly stating their territorial ambitions. Britain and France wanted to preserve the existing order, but were haunted by World War I and the Great Depression. The Soviet Union and the United States remained largely on the sidelines. The United States was firmly in the grip of isolationism. This fragile balance set the stage for dramatic events. In 1936, Hitler took his first gamble on the international stage. He ordered troops into the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles. This challenged France and Britain, but Hitler was nervous. France, unwilling to act without Britain, did nothing. The British felt Germany was simply marching into their own back garden. Hitler had won, his popularity soared. The remilitarization shifted Europe's balance of power, emboldening Hitler and shortening the road to war. In July 1936, Spain erupted into civil war Republicans versus Franco's nationalists. The conflict quickly drew in Hitler and Mussolini, who sent troops and planes to support Franco, using Spain as a testing ground for new weapons and tactics. Britain and France, paralyzed by fear of escalation, stuck to a failed policy of non-intervention, while the Soviets and international volunteers aided the Republicans. The war became a brutal preview of World War II, with atrocities like Guernica foreshadowing horrors to come. Lessons learned in Spain would soon be unleashed across Europe. As Spain burned, Hitler and Mussolini drew closer, forming the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. Soon after, Germany and Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact, targeting the Soviet Union and linking Europe's and Asia's conflicts. Italy joined the pact in 1937, cementing the Axis alliance. This bloc of aggressive powers now threatened the global order, united by their desire to overturn the status quo. The Axis was now a reality, and the world was on notice. In July 1937, a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge sparked full-scale war between China and Japan. Japanese forces unleashed brutal campaigns, capturing cities like Shanghai and Nanjing, where atrocities shocked the world. The Second Sino-Japanese War would rage for years, claiming millions of lives. Asia was now engulfed in conflict, paralleling Europe's rising tensions. The world's two great wars had begun. Despite mounting aggression, Britain and France clung to appeasement, desperate to avoid another war. In the US, isolationism prevailed. Roosevelt's call for action was rejected by the public and Congress. The League of Nations proved powerless, and the democracy's inaction emboldened the Axis. By the end of 1937, 2 wars raged, and the world's defenders stood idle. Hitler saw his opportunity to strike again. In early 1938, Hitler set his sights on Austria, using threats and political pressure to force its leader's submission. When Austria's chancellor tried to resist with a national vote, Hitler demanded his resignation and prepared for invasion. Mussolini, now Hitler's ally, gave his approval, and Britain and France did nothing. German troops marched in unopposed, Austria was annexed, cheered by crowds. Another barrier fell, and Hitler's ambitions grew bolder. With Austria in the Reich, Hitler eyed Czechoslovakia, a prosperous nation with a strong army and border. The Sudetenland, home to over 3 million ethnic Germans, became the focus. Nazi agitators stirred unrest, claiming oppression. By the summer of 1938, Europe was on the brink of war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, determined to prevent war, believed negotiation was key. The Czechs found themselves isolated as allies discussed ceding territory to appease Hitler, setting the stage for betrayal. In a dramatic effort to avert war, Neville Chamberlain decided to engage in personal, face-to-face diplomacy with Adolf Hitler. In mid-September 1938, the 69-year-old Prime Minister, who had rarely flown before, boarded a plane to Germany to meet the Führer at Berchtesgaden. At this meeting, Hitler demanded the right for the Sudeten Germans to self-determination, and hinted strongly that he was prepared to risk World War to achieve it. Chamberlain returned to London and, along with the French, devised a plan to pressure the Czechoslovak government into ceding all territories where more than 50% of the population was German. Under intense pressure from their so-called allies, the Czechs reluctantly agreed to this painful sacrifice. Peace seemed to have been secured. But when Chamberlain flew back to Germany for a second meeting, this time at Bad Godesberg, he was shocked to find that Hitler had raised his demands. The Führer was no longer satisfied with a simple transfer of territory. He now demanded the immediate military occupation of the entire Sudetenland by October 1st, with no time for an international commission to sort out the details. He presented Chamberlain with an ultimatum. These new demands were too much even for Chamberlain, who saw them as unacceptable. War now seemed inevitable. Britain and France began to mobilize their forces. In London, gas masks were distributed, and trenches were dug in public parks. The world held its breath, expecting the declaration of war at any moment. Just as all hope seemed lost, a last-minute intervention came from Benito Mussolini. At Chamberlain's request, the Italian leader stepped in to act as a mediator. He persuaded Hitler to postpone his ultimatum for 24 hours and to agree to a four-power conference to settle the issue. On September 29, 1938, the leaders of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy, Hitler, Chamberlain, Édouard Daladier, and Mussolini, met in the German city of Munich. The purpose of the conference was to find a peaceful solution to the crisis. However, there were two nations conspicuously absent from the negotiating table: the Soviet Union, which was deliberately excluded, and most importantly, Czechoslovakia, whose fate was being decided. The Munich conference was a foregone conclusion. Chamberlain and Daladier, desperate to avoid war, agreed to virtually all of Hitler's demands. The resulting Munich agreement, signed in the early hours of September 30th, stipulated that Czechoslovakia must hand over the Sudetenland to Germany immediately. The Czech government was not consulted. They were simply presented with the terms and told that if they refused, they would be on their own to face a German invasion. Abandoned by their allies and facing impossible odds, the Czechs had no choice but to submit. Hitler had achieved another stunning victory without firing a shot. He had dismantled a sovereign democratic state with the full complicity of the Western powers. Appeasement had reached its peak. Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich, declaring peace for our time. Winston Churchill condemned the agreement. "You chose dishonor, and you will have war." Critics argued Chamberlain had emboldened Hitler, sacrificing Czechoslovakia and handing Germany strategic advantages. Stalin, distrustful of the West, saw the agreement as collusion, pushing him towards a deal with Hitler. The illusion of peace bought only months, at the cost of a greater war. Just a few weeks after the Munich agreement, an event occurred inside Germany that exposed the brutal, violent nature of the Nazi regime to the entire world. It shattered any remaining illusions that Hitler was merely a conventional nationalist leader with limited, reasonable goals. On November 7, 1938, a young Polish-Jewish student named Herschel Greenspan, distraught over the deportation of his parents from Germany, walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot a junior diplomat, Ernst vom Rath. When vom Rath died 2 days later, the Nazi leadership seized upon the event as a pretext to unleash a long-planned, vicious pogrom against the Jewish population of Germany and the newly annexed territories of Austria. On the night of November 9th to 10th, what became known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, was unleashed. It was not a spontaneous outburst of public anger, as Nazi propaganda claimed, but a carefully orchestrated wave of violence carried out by SA stormtroopers and Hitler youth members across the Reich. Synagogues were burned, Jewish-owned businesses were looted and destroyed, and Jewish homes were ransacked. The streets were littered with the shattered glass from thousands of windows, giving the event its name. The violence was savage and public. Jewish men, women, and children were beaten in the streets, and nearly 100 were murdered. It was a terrifying display of state-sanctioned terror. The aftermath of Kristallnacht was just as brutal. The following day, some 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to newly established concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald. The Nazi government then cynically blamed the Jewish community for the destruction. They were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks for the damage and were barred from collecting insurance payments. A flood of new anti-Semitic decrees was passed, systematically stripping Jews of their remaining property and rights, and pushing them out of public life entirely. Kristallnacht marked a horrifying escalation in the Nazi persecution of the Jews. It was a transition from legislative discrimination and social exclusion to open physical violence on a massive scale. The news and images of the pogrom shocked the world. In the United States, President Roosevelt recalled his ambassador from Berlin in protest. In Britain, the government eased immigration restrictions for Jewish children, leading to the Kindertransport rescue missions that saved thousands. However, there was no stronger international action, no sanctions were imposed, and no country opened its doors wide to the flood of Jewish refugees desperate to escape Germany. For Hitler, this lack of a meaningful international response was yet another sign of weakness. It confirmed that he could act with impunity within his own borders. For the world, Kristallnacht was a horrifying glimpse into the dark, hateful core of the Nazi ideology. It showed that a regime capable of such barbarity against its own people would not hesitate to unleash it upon others. The peace secured at Munich did not even last 6 months. Hitler never intended to honor the agreement, seeing it as a stepping stone to weaken Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, he plotted the destruction of the Czech state, shattering illusions about his intentions. Hitler summoned President Hoxha to Berlin and, through intimidation, forced him to sign away his country's existence. German troops then crossed the border, occupying Prague. This was different. Hitler was conquering a non-German people, revealing his imperialist ambitions. The mask had slipped, shocking Chamberlain and ending appeasement. It was clear Hitler sought domination of Europe, making war inevitable. With Czechoslovakia gone, Hitler's next target was obvious: Poland. Recreated by the Treaty of Versailles, Poland was wedged between Germany and East Prussia. The Polish corridor gave Poland access to the sea, but separated East Prussia from Germany. Hitler demanded Danzig's return and a German-controlled railway across the corridor. Poland refused, determined not to suffer Czechoslovakia's fate. Britain, reversing its policy, pledged to aid Poland if attacked, a clear warning to Hitler. Hitler, believing it a bluff, ordered preparations for the invasion of Poland. The guarantee failed to deter war. It only made it inevitable. As the crisis over Poland deepened, the Axis powers moved to strengthen their bonds, transforming their partnership into a formal military alliance. Hitler wanted Mussolini's support. Mussolini, eager to prove his strength, launched his own act of aggression. In April 1939, Italian forces invaded Albania. This brought the dictators closer, and in May, the Pact of Steel was signed. This was a full-blown military alliance. The two nations pledged to come to each other's aid if either became involved in a war. The alliance was designed for conquest and reordering Europe, signaling to Britain and France that the fascist powers were ready for a fight. However, Italy was not ready for war, a fact Hitler ignored, assuming Mussolini would honor the pact. As Hitler finalized plans to invade Poland, he sought to avoid a two-front war. Negotiations with Britain and France were failing, with deep distrust on both sides. Stalin then explored a shocking alternative and began secret talks with Berlin. On August 23, 1939, the world was shocked as Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. A secret protocol carved up Eastern Europe, with Poland divided between them. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler could now invade Poland. The Nazi-Soviet Pact sent shockwaves across the globe. In London and Paris, it was met with disbelief. The pact made war virtually certain, giving Hitler the green light to attack Poland. Britain formalized its pledge to Poland. Mussolini declared he would remain neutral. Hitler hesitated and canceled the invasion order. The final week of August was a flurry of ultimatums. Millions waited to hear if peace or war would prevail. Hitler signed Directive Number 1 for the conduct of the war. At 4:45 a.m., September 1, 1939, the German war machine was unleashed against Poland without a formal declaration. The invasion, codenamed Case White, was a terrifying demonstration of blitzkrieg warfare. The Luftwaffe began bombing Polish airfields and cities, including Warsaw. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Westerplatte Peninsula. The Second World War had begun in Europe. The Polish army fought bravely but was outmatched. Britain and France declared war after Germany ignored their ultimatum. On September 17th, the Soviet Red Army invaded from the east. By October, Poland was conquered and partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. The first campaign was over, setting a dark precedent. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was a strangely quiet period in Western Europe. After the frantic declarations of war that followed the invasion of Poland, an eerie calm descended upon the front line. This period became known as the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg, meaning sitting war. While Poland was brutally dismembered, the British and French armies manned their defensive positions, primarily the formidable Maginot Line in France, and waited. There were no major land battles, no large-scale bombing raids, just a tense and uneasy stalemate. For many, it felt as though the war might not happen in earnest. But this was a dangerous illusion. Behind the scenes, Adolf Hitler was preparing his next move, planning to unleash his blitzkrieg tactics on the unsuspecting West. The Phony War came to an abrupt and violent end on April 9, 1940. In a swift and daring operation codenamed Weserübung, German forces launched a surprise invasion of two neutral countries, Denmark and Norway. The invasion of Denmark was over in a matter of hours. The small nation was completely overwhelmed and surrendered almost immediately. The primary strategic prize, however, was Norway. Access to Norway's long coastline and its deep fjords would provide the German Navy with excellent bases from which to raid British shipping in the Atlantic. Critically, it would also secure the vital sea lanes used to transport high-grade Swedish iron ore, essential for Germany's war industries, which passed through the Norwegian port of Narvik. The Allies were caught completely off guard, although they too had been planning to mine Norwegian waters to stop the iron ore shipments. The Germans struck first with stunning speed and efficiency. German warships steamed into major Norwegian ports, while elite paratroopers seized key airfields. The Norwegian army and a small British and French expeditionary force that was hastily sent to help put up a brave fight, particularly in the northern part of the country around Narvik. For a brief time, it seemed the Allies might be able to hold on. However, German air superiority proved decisive. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing Allied positions and supply ships, making it impossible to sustain the campaign. By early June, the battle for Norway was over. The Allies were forced to withdraw, and the Norwegian king and his government fled to London to continue the fight in exile. The campaign was a disaster for the Allies and a stunning success for Germany. Hitler had secured his northern flank and his crucial iron ore supply for the rest of the war. The defeat had immediate and dramatic political consequences in Britain. The failure in Norway shattered confidence in Neville Chamberlain's leadership. On May 10th, the same day Germany launched its main offensive in the West, Chamberlain resigned as prime minister. He was replaced by the one man who had consistently warned of the Nazi threat, Winston Churchill. On May 10, 1940, the same day Winston Churchill became prime minister, Hitler unleashed the full fury of his war machine on Western Europe. Case Yellow, the German invasion of France and the Low Countries, began. The German plan was a masterpiece of military deception and audacity. The Allies expected the main German attack to be a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, coming through central Belgium. As German forces invaded Belgium and the Netherlands, the best British and French armies raced north to meet them, falling perfectly into Hitler's trap. This was exactly what the German High Command had wanted them to do, luring them away from the real point of attack. The main German thrust was not through the flat plains of Belgium, but through the Ardennes forest, a hilly and densely wooded area that the French military considered impenetrable for tanks. It was a massive gamble. A huge concentration of German panzer divisions, spearheaded by generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, secretly advanced through the forest's narrow roads. On May 13th, they burst out of the Ardennes near the French town of Sedan, completely bypassing the northern end of the Maginot Line. They had punched a massive hole in the Allied front where it was weakest, and now there was almost nothing between them and the English Channel. The Allied armies in Belgium were about to be cut off. The speed of the German advance was, honestly, breathtaking. The blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Poland were now unleashed on the west with even greater effect. The panzers did not stop to consolidate their gains or wait for the slower-moving infantry. They raced across northern France, creating chaos and panic in their wake. The French command structure, rigid and slow to react, was completely paralyzed by the speed and ferocity of the assault. They were fighting the last war, unable to comprehend or counter this new, terrifying form of mobile warfare. Communication lines were cut, orders failed to arrive, and the French army, considered by many to be the finest in the world, simply disintegrated. Within 10 days, the German tanks had reached the coast, trapping the entire British expeditionary force and the best French and Belgian armies in a pocket with their backs to the sea. The Netherlands had already surrendered on May 15th, and Belgium would surrender on May 28th. The road to Paris was now wide open. On June 10th, Italy declared war on France and Britain, hoping to grab some territory before the fighting was over. The French government fled Paris, declaring it an open city. On June 22, 1940, in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had signed the armistice in 1918, France formally surrendered. In less than 6 weeks, Hitler had achieved what the Kaiser's armies could not in 4 years. With the French armies collapsing and German panzers closing in, the Allied forces were trapped. Cornered around Dunkirk, it seemed the British army was about to be annihilated. But Hitler halted the panzers, giving the Allies an opportunity. The British Admiralty initiated Operation Dynamo, a mass evacuation from the beaches. Hundreds of small civilian boats sailed across the channel to rescue the soldiers. Despite constant bombing, soldiers patiently waited to be rescued. Operation Dynamo saved nearly 340,000 Allied soldiers. It was a defeat, but also a deliverance. Churchill called it a miracle, a symbol of British resilience. As the German armies were completing their conquest of France, Benito Mussolini saw an opportunity he just couldn't resist. The Italian dictator had been growing increasingly anxious and honestly envious of Hitler's stunning successes. He had signed the Pact of Steel, binding Italy to Germany's side, but had declared non-belligerence when the war began, knowing his country was, well, militarily unprepared. Now, with France on the verge of total collapse, Mussolini feared being left out of the spoils of victory. He wanted to secure Italy's place at the table when the new map of Europe was drawn, and he craved the glory of a military triumph to bolster his fascist regime. He believed the war was all but over. On June 10, 1940, from the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, Mussolini announced to a cheering crowd that Italy was declaring war on France and Great Britain. He told his people that Italy was entering the fight to break the territorial and military chains that suffocate us in our sea. He dreamed of creating a new Roman Empire, dominating the Mediterranean, which he called Mare Nostrum, our sea, and expanding Italian influence in North Africa and the Balkans. It seemed like a safe bet. France was already defeated, and Mussolini believed that Britain, now standing alone, would soon be forced to sue for peace. His decision was a cynical act of opportunism, a stab in the back, as President Roosevelt described it. The initial Italian military efforts, however, were far from glorious. The Italian army launched an invasion of southern France through the Alps, but they were held back by a small and determined French force, making very little progress before France surrendered to Germany. More significantly, Italy's entry into the war opened up new and important theaters of conflict. The war was no longer confined to Western and Northern Europe. It now spread to the vast deserts of North Africa and the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. British forces in Egypt, guarding the crucial Suez Canal, now faced a massive Italian army in the neighboring colony of Libya. A new front had been opened. This expansion of the war would have enormous long-term consequences. The fighting in North Africa would become a major campaign, draining resources from both sides for the next 3 years. The British Royal Navy, though heavily outnumbered, began a long and difficult struggle against the Italian fleet for control of the Mediterranean. A battle vital for supplying the island fortress of Malta and the British armies in Egypt. Mussolini's gamble, intended to be a quick and easy grab for glory, instead locked Italy into a protracted and costly conflict for which it was ill-equipped. His decision ultimately turned the Mediterranean and North Africa into major battlegrounds of the Second World War. After the fall of France, Great Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler, underestimating the British spirit, planned an invasion, Operation Sea Lion. Germany first had to destroy the Royal Air Force. The air campaign began in July 1940. The Luftwaffe targeted RAF Fighter Command. They launched massive raids against airfields and radar stations. The defense fell to young pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes, aided by an effective air defense system. Radar provided early warnings, allowing interceptions. In late August, the RAF was stretched thin. A shift to bombing London gave the RAF breathing space. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe faced a huge response and suffered losses. By October, Operation Sea Lion was postponed. The RAF had won. While the Battle of Britain was raging in the skies over England, the Axis powers were moving to formalize and expand their alliance on a global scale. The stunning success of Germany in Europe had really impressed and alarmed the military leaders in Japan. They saw the European colonial powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, as weakened and distracted, which presented a golden opportunity for Japan to expand its own empire into Southeast Asia. This region, rich in vital resources like oil, rubber, and tin, was absolutely crucial for Japan's war effort in China and its long-term ambitions to dominate the Pacific. However, one major obstacle stood in their way: the United States. The United States, while still officially neutral, was clearly moving to oppose Axis aggression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, deeply alarmed by the fall of France, had started to provide increasing aid to Great Britain. In September of 1940, he arranged the so-called Destroyers for Bases Agreement, giving the British 50 old American destroyers in exchange for long-term leases on naval bases in the Atlantic. This was a clear sign of American support for Britain. Furthermore, the United States was applying growing economic pressure on Japan in response to its war in China and its moves towards Southeast Asia, imposing embargoes on strategic materials like scrap iron and steel. Japan saw these actions as a direct threat to its imperial ambitions. To counter the growing American involvement and to formalize their shared interests, the three main Axis powers came together. On September 27, 1940, in a grand ceremony in Berlin, representatives from Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact. This agreement created a formal military alliance between the three nations, officially establishing the Axis as a global bloc. The pact recognized Germany and Italy's leadership in creating a new order in Europe, and Japan's leadership in creating a new order in Greater East Asia. It was a public declaration of their intent to divide the world into their own spheres of influence. The most important clause of the Tripartite Pact was a mutual defense pledge. It stated that if any of the three signatory powers were attacked by a nation not currently involved in the European war or the war in China, the other two would come to its aid. This clause was aimed squarely at one country, the United States. It was a warning shot designed to intimidate America and make it think twice about entering the war. The hope was that the threat of a two-ocean war against Germany and Italy in the Atlantic and Japan in the Pacific would keep the United States on the sidelines. The pact, however, had the opposite effect. It hardened American resolve and confirmed to many that the conflicts in Europe and Asia were part of a single, coordinated global threat to freedom and democracy. As 1941 began, Hitler's gaze was fixed firmly on the invasion of the Soviet Union. This required absolute security on his southeastern flank. But Mussolini's ambitions had created a dangerous situation in the Balkans. Mussolini launched a disastrous invasion of Greece. The Greek victory had opened the door for Great Britain to intervene, posing a threat to Romanian oil fields. Hitler could not launch his invasion of the Soviet Union while his oil supply was exposed. He diverted his forces to secure the region. He put immense pressure on the countries of the Balkans to join the Axis powers. The key nation was Yugoslavia. Hitler was absolutely enraged by the coup in Belgrade. The Luftwaffe subjected Belgrade to a brutal terror bombing campaign. German forces invaded both Yugoslavia and Greece. By the end of April, the Nazi flag was flying over Athens. While German forces advanced through the Balkans, the North African Desert War took a dramatic turn. After initial Italian defeats against the British, Hitler sent a small German force to Tripoli in February 1941. Commanded by Erwin Rommel, the Afrika Korps launched a surprise attack in March. Rommel's offensive reversed British gains except for Tobruk, and earned him the nickname Desert Fox. His arrival ensured a long, attritional campaign tying down British resources. As Britain fought for survival, its fate was being decided in the cold, gray waters of the North Atlantic. Hitler unleashed his U-boats to wage a campaign against British shipping, aiming to starve the island into submission. This became known as the Battle of the Atlantic. President Roosevelt watched with growing alarm and devised Lend-Lease. This gave the president the authority to lend equipment and supplies. War materials began to flow across the Atlantic, providing Britain with the means to keep fighting. Lend-Lease ensured Britain's survival, profoundly shaping the conflict. While the United States was drawing closer to the war in Europe, tensions on the other side of the world were escalating toward a breaking point. The relationship between the United States and the Empire of Japan had been deteriorating for years, driven by Japan's brutal war of conquest in China. The signing of the Tripartite Pact in September of 1940 had formalized the alliance between Japan, Germany, and Italy, confirming to many Americans that Japan was part of a global conspiracy of aggression. In response, the Roosevelt administration had steadily increased its economic pressure on Tokyo, hoping to curb its expansionism without resorting to war. The primary American weapon was the oil embargo. Japan was an island nation with very few natural resources of its own. It was almost completely dependent on imports for the oil that fueled its industries and, most critically, its Navy and Air Force. A staggering 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. The American government knew that this dependency was Japan's Achilles heel. Throughout late 1940 and early 1941, Washington began to tighten the screws, gradually restricting the sale of aviation fuel and other strategic materials. This placed the Japanese leadership in an impossible position. They either had to abandon their imperial ambitions, or they had to find an alternative source of oil. The Japanese government was divided. A civilian faction, led by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye, hoped that a diplomatic solution could still be found. They engaged in protracted negotiations with the American Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington. However, real power in Tokyo lay with the military, particularly the hardline war minister, General Hideki Tojo. The military saw the American embargo not as a tool of diplomacy, but as an act of economic warfare that threatened the very existence of the empire. They believed that a confrontation with the United States was inevitable, and that Japan should strike before the oil embargo completely crippled their war machine. They began to draw up secret plans for a bold, preemptive attack. The target of their planning was the rich, oil-producing territories of Southeast Asia, the British colony of Malaya, and most importantly, the Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia. Conquering these territories would solve Japan's resource problem and make it self-sufficient. But the Japanese military knew that such an operation would almost certainly bring the United States into the war, as it would threaten the American-controlled Philippines. To prevent the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with their southern conquest, they devised a daring and incredibly risky plan, a surprise knockout blow against the main American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. As the first half of 1941 came to a close, the two nations were on a collision course, though most of the world was still watching Europe. The uneasy peace of 1936 cascaded into the global inferno of 1941. It was a relentless cascade of aggression, each event building momentum. It began with Hitler's gamble in the Rhineland, a test the Western democracies failed. He absorbed Austria, then dismembered Czechoslovakia. The invasion of Poland was the next step in a successful strategy. In Asia, Japan's invasion of China was part of this global breakdown. The Tripartite Pact linked these theaters, creating a global alliance. By 1941, this cascade had washed over much of the globe, heading towards total war. The outbreak of World War II was a story of failure, representing the collapse of the post-WWO international system. The Treaty of Versailles sowed resentment, and the League of Nations proved an empty promise. Its weakness exposed international law as toothless. Appeasement, a symptom of this failure, was rooted in fear and misreading dictators' intentions. The Munich Agreement only delayed the war. The US, gripped by isolationism, and the Soviet Union, seeking its own game, left Britain and France tragically unprepared. By mid-1941, the stage was set for the conflict in Europe and Asia to merge into a global war. The final link was about to be forged in the Pacific, with escalating tensions between the US and Japan. The American oil embargo forced Japan to choose between abandoning its expansionist dreams or seizing Southeast Asia's oil-rich territories. They chose war, making a clash with the US inevitable. This led to a new kind of total war on an unprecedented global scale. By the end of 1941, the world stood on the precipice of a planetary conflagration.